Welcome back. So up until now, we've learned about integers, floats, strings, and Boolean values. So let's try and tie some of those things together. Let's imagine you were Facebook. How do you think Facebook works underneath the hood when it comes to your profile? Well, they would have, let's say, a variable called name, and this will have your name. And then they'll probably have a variable with your age, let's say 50. I'm not actually 50, but I'm pretending to be for this case, just so I sound wiser. And then let's say relationship status. So again, we also have relationship status on Facebook. And for now, let's say single. So that's my Facebook profile right there. Now, if we wanted to perhaps change that, let's say my relationship status all of a sudden goes from single to it's complicated. Well, that's an easy fix. We would just do relationship status equals to it's complicated. And remember, because of the single quote, we'll have to do backslash it's complicated. And now if I print my relationship status, you'll see that it's been updated to it's complicated. I am no longer single. Hooray! But this is pretty simple. Let's do something more complicated. And this is going to be a fun exercise. Let's create a program that guesses your age. Let's use the input method that we've seen before. Remember, the input method allows us to type something in here and receive it as input. So we can assign that to a variable. So let's say this variable is going to be birth year, and that's going to equal the input that's going to ask when or what year were you born. Now, from here, I want you to pause the video and try to solve this yourself. How can you make it so that at the end of this program, you're going to get asked, what year were you born? You're going to type in your year, and then it's going to print out your age is whatever the age is. So pause the video, try and solve this on your own. Mind you, there is a bit of a trick in here. So if you get stuck, try to Google around and figure out what the issue may be. Again, part of being a programmer is trying to solve these problems that you don't know the answers to. All right, let me show you my solution. We have our birth year here that we're going to store in a variable. And now we're going to calculate the age. I'm going to say age equals, well, it's going to equal the current year, let's say 2019, and then 2019 here is going to get subtracted from whatever the birth year that you entered. So let's enter that. And then we're simply going to say print your age is, and we want to use an F string here. So I'm going to add an F here. And then simply say age. If I run this, I get what year were you born? I was born in 1986. We get an error. And if you try this yourself, you may have encountered this error. We get something called a type error. And there's lots of errors that you can get in Python. Again, we have a section on error, so don't stress too much about it. But if you read here, it says unsupported operand type S for minus int and string. Let's try and debug this. It looks like we're using minus on an integer and a string. So let me print out here the type of birth year. If I run this, and let's enter 1986, I get class string. And this is a little gotcha, because what input does is it asks you for an input. But that input that I wrote, 1986, well, that actually gets converted to a string and assigned to birth year. So what that means is that we're trying to subtract a number or a string from a number. So how do we solve this issue? Well, you'd have to turn this into an integer. And this is something that we saw previously. What we need to do is to convert this into an integer with using the int function. So let's try that. If I remove this and click run, I'll say 1986. And look at that. Your age is 33. We've created a program that is able to tell your age based on the year that you were born. Now, this may have been tricky to you, but it teaches an important concept in programming. That is, sometimes you're storing data into different data types. And sometimes you need those different data types to interact together. So you'll see a lot of problems where you have to convert a data type. And this is a very common one where you take an input that's a string and then you convert it to something like an integer. So you can perform a mathematical operation. And that's why, if you remember, we gave you a list of all our data types in Python, the fundamental data types, and all of them were blue because, well, each one of these are actions, are functions that we can use. For example, I converted the birth year into integer, but I could have also converted this to a float, for example. And if I run this, it would still work because Python knows that, well, we can use integers and floats in mathematical operation, but you can see here that it's converted into a float now. If we convert this into a Boolean, and I click run, your age is 2018. That's really confusing, right? Well, that's because this gets turned into true, and underneath the hood, Python does something weird, where a true value is converted to 1. Because Boolean, remember, it's 1 or 0, true or false. All right, hopefully this didn't confuse you too much. It's something that we'll encounter throughout the course, so don't worry, we'll get more and more practice. However, I hope you get to practice this a little bit to really understand what's going on, because although this is a couple of lines of code, the principles that we use here, we're going to use throughout bigger and bigger code bases.